Hello, it's Matt from Mossy Earth. Today we're in the Scottish Highlands at the farm of Duncan Pepper and joined by his close friend Tom Edwards. Both are advocates for a wilder Scotland through land management reforms, rewilding and ecosystem restoration. Duncan, who grew up on the sheep farm, has been actively involved in conservation from a young age and currently works in nature-based tourism as a fishing guide. While Tom, an avid hill walker, works as an ecologist throughout Scotland, working on a variety of land management and restoration projects. Today we're going to be discussing the current state of Scotland's wilderness, rewilding and its implications, and what the future holds for Scotland's countryside. So without further ado, I hand you over to Duncan and Tom.
I grew up on this farm, and this is a wee 100-acre farm in Highland, Perthshire, and I've been involved in all the jobs that go along with having a farm since I was a very young lad, with animals on the farm but also with forestry and stuff like that. And as I got older I got into doing things like volunteering for the Woodland Trust on tree planting projects, showing people how to plant trees because I had learnt it here first, or where to plant them, what species, things like that. And since then I've done some volunteering in fisheries as well, and I work in the outdoors, and we'll get to that later, I think.
I became interested in the wildlife in Scotland as a teenager due to family holidays up here. That led me to study to volunteer with the RSPB, and I then studied agriculture and forestry at university. I worked for 15 years as a civil servant in Edinburgh in agriculture and environmental policy. And then 8 years ago I retrained as a field ecologist with the Scottish Wildlife Trust, and for the last 7 years I've been an ecological consultant. I've got my own business doing that.
Okay. All right. So how would you describe the current state of Scotland's countryside or wilderness? And what were the main driving factors that brought Scotland to this point?
Right. Well, wilderness, I noticed that you said wilderness. To many people, perhaps most people who visit Scotland, it probably does seem like a wilderness. But there is very little what you might call natural habitat in Scotland. I mean, really a pocket handkerchief size that hasn't been affected by man. And Scotland's countryside has been influenced by humans for millennia. We now know that forests started disappearing millennia ago, and that's a process that's continued right up until recently. So just about all our landscapes are heavily modified by man. The east coast of Scotland and the south is where you've got lower, more fertile land, taking up about a fifth of the country, and the remaining 4/5 is upland, which is managed for a mixture of hunting, so hunting of red deer and grouse, extensive livestock grazing and commercial forestry, and then probably in the last 20 or 30 years has been increasing ownership by conservation-minded owners.
The current state of Scotland's land, in a word, is degraded. It's way below its potential, and that's largely as a result of bad land management. What I consider bad land management. And what I consider bad land management is land which is managed for the benefit of very few animals, no plants at all, and for very few people, and at the expense of all plant life, the vast majority of animals, and the vast majority of people. That's in a nutshell.
And how well known is it that it's degraded amongst?
I would say there is a very small percentage or proportion of the population that's aware of just how degraded it is, but mostly because they're not aware of quite what Scotland's potential is. But fortunately we do have a couple of examples within Scotland of good land management where you can visit and see what things could be like given half a chance. And a good point to put in here is that more than half of Scotland's land is sporting estate. So that's, as Tom said, either managed for the benefit of grouse or for deer, both of which is for shooting or hunting of those animals, and they're driving up the population, doing everything they can to maximise certainly the numbers of grouse, and on some estates to try and maximise the numbers of deer. Maximising grouse numbers means all sorts of bad management strategies, which I think we'll probably get to. Maximising the numbers of deer in a very broad sense means very, very few trees. If you've got lots of deer, you've got very few trees.
Yeah. Okay, and what changes have you seen in the last 10 to 20 years in land management, as well as people's perception of land management and the countryside?
Yeah, not nearly as much as I'd like. I would say since books like George Monbiot's Feral, there has been certainly a raising in public awareness of the issues surrounding land management. There's a guy called Andy Whiteman who's done some great work in highlighting the inequalities in land management and how it benefits very few people and is at the cost of very many people. Yeah, you go.
I think one big change is a result of change in agricultural policy in 2005. Extensive livestock farmers were no longer required to keep their animals in order to continue receiving the money, and so there's still, I think, somewhere around about 6-7 million sheep in Scotland, but there was more like 9 or 10 million at that time. So 3 million sheep have gone largely from the north and west of the country. So I think that is a fundamental change, which is probably the effects of which are still feeding through. Another thing which has changed is that the management on grouse moors in Scotland has become more intensive, if anything. They're being burnt more frequently, and several other management practices to do with the treatment of disease in grouse and so on are now widespread. On the more positive side of the ledger, as Duncan's just been saying, from the beginnings in the 1950s with the establishment of the first natural nature reserve in Scotland at Benay, there's been a gradual increase in the area of land that's managed for nature conservation by government, by charities who've become increasingly large landowners in Scotland, but increasingly now by a small but growing group of private landowners who are managing their land for biodiversity and managing it in a self-willed way, what's known as the rewilding type approach.
But proportionally, that's still a very small proportion of the people who do own land in Scotland. And it's, once you've got some awareness of what Scotland's potential is, it's very frustrating to see how slowly, how little changes are made, how long it takes to make even the most basic of changes. It's frustrating.
And you mentioned that the grouse hunting, the land management is even more intense now. What's driving that? Why is it more intense?
I think the people who advise grouse moor owners found a way. What used to happen, because it is a wild bird, it's not like pheasants and partridges which are reared in captivity and then released each year to then be shot. Grouse are wild and rear their own young. Their populations traditionally cycled, but grouse moor consultants, if you like, found a recipe which meant that there would be grouse in almost every year, and these techniques, which include putting out grit, which has got, because what happens, as with any species, when they get to a very high density, they become susceptible to disease. So they put out grit, which has got a medication on it. They even actually go around at night and catch birds with a lamp at night to dose them like you would dose a farmed animal. And also very, very much more attention to the burning of the heather, very, very intensive control of predators, both the ones that can be legally controlled And also there's now an almost overwhelming body of evidence which suggests that protected species are being killed in quite large numbers on many grouse moors.
So grouse moors, the heather is burned so that the grouse will be able to eat the young shoots of the heather as it regrows. This will allow for more food for grouse and therefore allow for a higher population. There are other tactics that they use to boost the population are to kill hares. Mountain hares might carry ticks, and those ticks might be picked up by grouse, and that might reduce grouse numbers. All sorts of birds are killed for the benefit of grouse. Pretty much all the raptors, and also corvids, and also that one guy or a group of guys can go out and shoot some birds. Pay rather a lot of money to go out and shoot a few birds, which.
And these groups of guys that are participating in the grouse hunting, would they be aware of what's happening? And then, because at some level they must enjoy being in nature, right? They must at some level enjoy the countryside.
Yeah.
How aware do you think they are?
Slightly aware. I mean, I think...
Very hard to answer.
Well, I think there's such a level of publicity in recent years has grown up around every time, because of satellite tagging of golden eagles, red kites and hen harriers. Every time one goes missing, then that's a news story which is widely reported, and so I think there is a general awareness that this is going on. Whether people who are actively involved in shooting are fully understand the extent to which, in my view, it's quite widespread is another matter. But I was going to just say a slightly different thing, which is that people often see a conflict between hunters and conservationists, and they think that everybody who's interested in conservation is anti-hunting. In mine, well, I'm speaking for you, Duncan, but in both our cases, nothing could really be further from the truth. Duncan runs a fishing guiding business. We both have been hunting deer together, and we both enjoy doing that, and we certainly wouldn't ever want to see a Scotland where people couldn't go hunting. And we totally recognise that it's an important part of the rural economy. It's simply that some of the management practices around hunting are limiting the ecological potential of Scotland, basically.
The land management practices and the paradigms that currently exist around hunting. So in the case of deer, for some reason, now we're stuck in this rut of whenever you go on, you pay for a deer stock, you're guaranteed a stag. I don't know why that needs to be the case, because you could certainly, for me, that it's not real hunting. If it's guaranteed that you're going to shoot something, you're not really hunting, you're just out murdering something which is, set up for you, basically. In the case of grouse, people expect to shoot very large numbers of grouse, whereas, with a small change in the way people think, and salmon fishing can be an example of this, because quite often it's the same people who do salmon fishing, grouse shooting and deer stalking. With salmon fishing, they're quite happy to accept the fact that they might not catch anything in the day, and quite often they will fish several days to catch a fish, and they're okay with that. And it actually, they value the fish all the more because of it. But why we can't adopt that same thinking for grouse or deer, I'm not sure. It's just a paradigm, but it would be great to change that.
It's more of a change in the paradigm in the land management, and the hunting. The hunting is part of the... What things would you wish to see changed? What would be the...
Where do you start?
Well, in terms of...
Generally, a country which is managed for the benefit of everyone that's there, and even for the visitors that come to visit. There is often discounted, but why shouldn't they be stakeholders in what exists here as well? At the moment, it's almost the opposite. It's how many? 40 people own...
400.
400 people own more than...
half of Scotland's
More
land.
than half of Scotland's land. So, that's a very small number of people owning a huge amount of land, and it benefits them a tiny other number of people whom it benefits. And when you think of things like car accidents with deer, or the amount that government has to spend on fencing to keep deer out of other property, or when it comes to shoots, pheasants proliferating the countryside because a sporting estate has pumped them out and they're digging up your brassicas, you're not very happy about it. It affects a lot of people.
Yeah.
So Scotland, through the UK, is a signatory to the Convention on Biodiversity, which set a target to stop biodiversity loss by 2010, and in common with many countries around the world, that target was not met. That target was then rolled over to 2020, and then an assessment is going on just now as to whether we're going to meet that target. But it's already been recognised by Scottish Natural Heritage, the government's own nature conservation advisor, that high deer numbers is one of the major obstacles to meeting that biodiversity target in Scotland. And I think also there's now a rapidly spreading awareness of the problem of the climate crisis that we're all in. And I think the Scottish government has in certain respects led the way, along with the UK government, it's fair to say, in setting very, very ambitious targets for greenhouse gas emission reductions. And indeed, they're now in the process of increasing those. We're looking at going for net zero in Scotland in the not too distant future. And I think that if the government here is serious about meeting those targets, and I've got no reason to suspect that they're not, every sector of society has to make a contribution to that. And the way that we use and manage land is has got a huge contribution to make. And the current land use in the uplands, which is my sort of area of special interest, certainly has got huge scope to change. And it's really about two things. It's about stopping the continual burning of moorland to create habitat for grouse, and allowing that moorland. I mean, just this morning we were looking at a site on this farm here where sheep, just the exclusion of sheep from an area resulted in rapid development of native woodland. And that's something that could happen widely, almost for free, purely by changing that management practice. And secondly, reducing red deer numbers down to a level which allows native woodland to develop and spread. And that in fact the requires more hunting, not less.
Yeah, there's an oft touted retort by the hunting fraternity that says, if we provide jobs, rural jobs in Scotland, were it not for grouse moors or sporting estates of all types, there would be very little work up here in remote areas of the Highlands. But actually, if your objective is reducing deer numbers, you need a whole lot more people doing that job.
Sure.
And sustaining those numbers at a low level. It's not just a short-term thing, It's not going to be all over in a couple of years. You need to keep on it.
Yeah.
And the fewer deer you have, the more you need to seek them out,
Yeah.
and the longer it takes
Yeah.
per person. Yeah.
Oh, okay. And going back to these estates, do they have any obligation to invest any of their revenue into conservation efforts, or because it's privately owned land they can do their own thing?
Yeah, so the money that comes in for fishing or hunting, for the most part, ends up in the pockets of the owner. Of course, they have expenses in running their estate, but those are their prerogatives. Estates, this is a good fallacy to burst the bubble off now. Estates often make excuses about not being able to do things because they can't afford to, but nobody buys an estate to make money. The vast majority of sporting estates lose money. Mike Daniels, who's a great ecologist in Scotland, has, I'm not sure it was him that came up with the saying, but it was him that I heard saying it, says, yeah, people don't own estates to make money, they own estates because they have money. and it's largely a playground for their pals, you know, to come and shoot deer for a couple of weeks a year, or grouse.
Is it slightly different in the States, right? The revenue from...
Yes, in the US you've got the Department of Natural Resources, or the Department of Fish and Game, depends on what state you're in, what they call it. But every penny that you pay in your permit goes to them, and all that money gets poured back into habitat restoration work, or things that at least compensate for maybe fish being depleted out of a river, or, you know, there's work that's done. And here there's not a lot of work, it's just going into someone's pocket.
The wrong pockets.
The wrong pockets, yeah.
I think in the profit and loss account of most, certainly red deer stalking estates and many grouse moors, they would be showing an annual loss on their, you know, so it's something that the owners do because that's their interest. On the other hand, the capital value of estates is increasing substantially, and so you know, there is a return there if the owner at some point decides to sell. But in terms of what is or has driven conservation action on privately owned estates, it's either been down to the individual motives of the estate owner, which we spoke about before, or because a particular piece of land has a legal conservation designation on it. To a lesser extent, the national designation, which is sites of special scientific interest, and more so for sites which are designated as special areas of conservation under the Habitats Directive. And in that case, if there is evidence that land management practices are damaging that nature conservation interest, then the government agencies have powers to intervene. They reviewed all the work that they'd done in terms of deer several years ago and found that in over half of the cases where they had tried to intervene, and their first approach is to work with landowners to get them to take action voluntarily, and they never have used their power that they have in Scotland to compel landowners to reduce the number of deer on their land. But in over half of the cases, I think I'm right in saying, where they'd worked to do that voluntarily, that the objectives had not been achieved. So I think enforcement, there's two government agencies that are involved in environmental regulation in Scotland. There's the Scottish Environment Protection Agency, which effectively regulates pollution and polluters, if you like, and Scottish Natural Heritage, which is the government's nature conservation advisor. And it's fair to say that there's
They're
quite
both toothless.
Well, what I was going to say was that SEPA has been rather more effective as a regulator than the nature conservation Scottish Natural Heritage, and so any kind of government enforcement to compel people to change the way they manage their land has to date been relatively limited.
Yeah.
And how many of these estates continue doing what they're doing because they've always done it, or?
That's a major problem. When someone takes on a new estate or inherits an estate, they go to the people that they can find with the most experience in managing estates, which is the way in which these old systems of managing estates keep going, rather than, you know, going to speak to an ecologist about what the best possible management of the estate is. Although that is starting to happen more these days, the norm is that, they go to the old gamekeeper and say, so what have you been doing for years? Or perhaps they have their own ideas about what they'd like to do, but when they approach the staff that have been working on that land a long time, they get told, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to do what we've always done because we think it works. But changing the minds of people who have been in a job for 30 or 40 years to take on a completely new, it's difficult.
Sure.
It's difficult.
But it's interesting, again, we were talking earlier about how there are different, even the same hunter can have different attitudes, whether they're fishing for salmon or going out to shoot deer. You can see some examples of areas where management practices have changed substantially, fundamentally and radically, like the example Duncan touched on earlier about culling of mountain hares, which also live on grouse moors. They are a host of a tick which can transmit a disease to the grouse. And there's contested scientific evidence as to whether this has any effect on grouse at all. But nonetheless, many of the grouse moor estates have adopted a policy of almost total eradication of mountain hares within the last 5 to 10 years. But when it comes down to something like in salmon fisheries, there's now quite a body of evidence which shows that, for example, having trees along the river bank to provide insect food for the young fish and to shade the pools, which is becoming increasingly important with climate change, the uptake of that type of evidence has been far less, I think. So it's strange what things people will latch onto and implement, and what things they won't.
Yeah, it's true.
Sure.
I just wanted to touch on, Tom was talking before about the red deer problem in Scotland, and it's important in a historical context to get a grasp on how long this has been going on. So the first government commission set up to look at the red deer problem was in 1872, and every consecutive year since that date the deer number has increased. It was a problem then, just imagine how much more of a problem it is now. Also, they didn't have then the other species that we've got. There was roe and red deer. And now we've got sika and fallow as well. Sika, which are interbreeding with red deer and sort of blurring the line. But between all four species, I don't have an exact number, but it's probably around 1 million now, between all four species. And that one of the first government inquiries to look at it hired an ecologist to come up with a number for the whole of Scotland for deer, and he thought about 60,000 might be about right for
as a sustainable level,
as a number to allow for natural regeneration of woodlands.
Right.
Anything above that. So on a smaller scale, 4 deer per square kilometre. If you've got that number or lower, this is a rough gauge because there are different types of ground, but 4 deer per square kilometre or less, you will have trees growing. Any more than that, and it will start to, it'll impact on the amount of trees that grow. And when you get up to sort of numbers that we've got in lots of parts of Scotland of 20 per square kilometre and above, you've got nothing. Old forests that are dying on their feet, never going to be replaced by anything below, or great swaths of land which are just barren without trees. And trees are extremely important for so many things. The deeper you dig into it, it's an endless story of an endless list of benefits that trees provide. There's so much to say about that.
Sure. Our next question. Rewilding has become a bit of a buzzword in recent years. What's your take on this sort of movement, and how do you think it should be implemented?
I think it's great. Any noise in that area is good. It starts to gather interest and attention among the general public as to what's going on with the land. And this is something that I think Scotland in particular desperately needs. People to show an interest in what's going on around them. Once you start learning about it, you see what's going on everywhere, and the majority of what's going on is not the best for Scotland, with some exceptions like the great work that Wildland is doing around Scotland, and there are others. But the majority of it is not great. We're reducing our potential, and that potential is in all sorts of ways, including even economics, which I often overlook. But the revenue potential from wildlife tourism is massive. With the reintroduction of beavers, it's been quite well documented how many people have come to check it out. Also with sea eagles on Mull, they took a good look at the change in numbers since there have been sea eagles being sighted with some regularity, and it's massive for tourism, the whole industry. Lots and lots of revenue.
And are any of these traditional estates sort of looking over their fence at these rewilding guys and thinking, well, they seem to be earning more money.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Certainly an objective of radical land reform, which is something that the Scottish Government has been talking about for a while, is to diversify land ownership. At the moment, you've got very few people who own huge estates. Now, if we were to change the regulations to say that when you sell an estate, it can only be a much smaller proportion of land, then you would, at the very least, end up with diversity of ownership. And so you would have people looking over the fence at someone who was doing it a bit better, had a load of trees, was getting lots of tourists visiting because they had more wildlife. Maybe they were hunting as well, and they were getting some of the species that they get in Norway, which is a similar climate and geology, like willow grouse, and they're doing woodland shoots, just something different, And if it's income streams they're looking at, then there's more diversity. Norway is quite a good example for having similar climate, similar geology, but different land management strategies, and landowners able to make an income from diverse streams. They're setting up pods that tourists can sleep in, or all kinds of things they're doing.
I think there's an awareness. So there's this dynamic between land reform, which basically means taking steps to change the way land is owned, and land use. And I think that some landowners who are perhaps most switched on will see that, irrespective of what their personal motivations are, and many landowners do have, as we've touched on, have a personal motivation to act in the interest of conservation. Even where that's not their primary motivation, they will see that perhaps if they do change the way they manage their land to achieve that will help act as a bit of a bulwark against government action to basically deprive them of it. Yeah,
Sure.
for want of a better way of putting it. But in terms of your previous question about rewilding, I tend to think in a Scottish context about restoration. And I always take the term rewilding to mean restoration, because I think that one of the things to put across is that the changes to the ecology of the uplands in this country have been so fundamental, with the removal of forest, sometimes millennia ago, that there has been a regime shift in the soils, which means that simply leaving it to nature, well, in fact, you can't leave it to nature, because you have to go in and do some management of deer in the absence of large carnivores. And even, we'll come to that perhaps, but in some places to return to a woodland ecosystem, if that's our objective, and I think that probably that is our objective in light of what I was saying earlier about the climate emergency, because what changes to land management can do is fundamentally alter the capacity of land to sequester and store carbon. So that should be our priority. So to return land from the condition it is now to a woodland ecosystem, both because of soils and distance from seed source, then there will, in many cases, need to be a human intervention if you want to see the change in the timescales that we need that change to occur. So I do think in terms of restoration, or to me, as long as the term rewilding encapsulates restoration, and I think in its practical application it does, then I think it's what's required.
Yeah, and there are animals that can play a really big role in helping us achieve our objectives for mitigating climate change. So beaver, for example, by holding water back in tributaries of rivers, last year we had a very dry year where it hardly rained from May right through to August, and the rivers were almost running dry. If we had a lot more beaver, a lot more water would be held in the uplands for a lot longer. They could also help with restoration of peat bogs. Peat bogs hold a lot of water as well. All these things yeah, animals play a big role and can help us achieve our objectives as long as it's all set up correctly.
And should rewilding be left, or restoration, as you said, should that be left to private ownership, or should that be something the government should be backing or is backing?
Whenever things are left to private ownership, nothing happens, is the experience. As I was saying, since, 1872, the first commission was set up to look at the red deer problem. That was asking owners, starting off asking, oh, do you think you might reduce your deer number? Oh yeah, sure, we'll do that. Nothing happens. Next year, we're going to push you to reduce your deer numbers. Oh yeah, nothing happens, and so on. You know, I've got the list of the reports from every single year then in 96, I think it became the 59 it became DCS and Deer Commission Scotland, and then SNH took it on. Anyway, I've got reports from every year, just a short write-up saying what they've been doing this year and how things have progressed, and they didn't progress ever. So if that's anything to go by, we've had enough carrot, it's time for the stick.
And a slight counterpoint to that, 150 years ago, grouse moors didn't exist, or about 200 years ago, grouse moors didn't exist, and now you have somewhere upwards of 1 million hectares in Britain which is managed in that way. An entire landscape dedicated to a pursuit which has arisen out of a fashion. Now that is a fashion can be fickle, but that is a fashion which has persisted. But who's to say that fashion won't change?
Yeah.
And in a lot of respects, I think the private sector can be a lot more effective at creating change. I mean, I referred earlier to having spent 15 years working in government, and one of the reasons I left was because I was so frustrated about the extent to which I saw positive change actually being delivered. So I think when it is working in the way that you might want it to work, the private sector can be incredibly effective at delivering change.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't rule that out. And so it's really Dick Balharry, who was one of the sort of founding fathers of rewilding in Scotland, if you like. He talks about a three-legged stool of regulation, incentive, and basically motivation or fashion, as you might say, or wanting to do the right thing. And I think there are all those three elements, and different things will work for different people. But there certainly has to be an effective regulation in the way that land is used, and that in terms of the way we manage the uplands. Well, in fact, in terms of the way we manage just about all land in this country, that largely doesn't exist.
Yeah. In species terms, for some of your listeners that might not know that much about Scotland, there were bears and wolves and beaver here for millennia. The last wolf was shot around 200 years ago. Beavers were somewhere near the same time. They've been reintroduced now. And there were in the past bears as well. I think 600 odd years ago was the last bear.
Something like that.
Yeah. So we have that history. We have plants and an ecosystem which has co-evolved alongside these things. So reintroduction of these species, although you might hear a lot of bluster from a lot of people, isn't some mad change. Sure. Actually. In wildlife terms, the amount of time that they've not been there is nothing, compared to the amount of time they have been there.
And touching on the point about fashion, there is a growing number of advocates for the reintroduction of large carnivores.
Yeah.
What's your opinion of a reintroduction of, say, lynx or bear or wolf?
I think Scotland is quite possibly ready now to receive some lynx, and wolves. There's a debate about whether there's quite enough habitat for them. Bear, possibly not yet, but hopefully at some stage in the future. Focusing of energies is quite a good... Why don't you talk about that?
Well, just on the wolf reintroduction, I went on a study tour in Latvia a few years back, and we were very lucky to be shown around by the Latvian expert who worked for the State Forest Service there and was a European level expert in large carnivores. And he had been on a visit to Scotland, and he flew to Aberdeen and was picked up at Aberdeen Airport and driven to the Cairngorms, which is about an hour and a half's drive. And when they'd been looking around the Cairngorms for sort of half an hour or so driving through that landscape, the Scottish chap who picked him up said, you know, have you seen anywhere yet that you think might be suitable for wolves? And he basically said, well, yeah, since you picked me up at the airport, you know. So I think that one of the things that we're learning about wolves is that looking at where the sorts of landscapes that they're now spreading into in continental Europe, our idea about what a wolf habitat is, and it has to be this kind of like Yellowstone type huge expanses of pristine forest, is not. And the reason wolves have retreated into the least populated and wildest parts of Europe is because of human persecution, not because of the suitability of the habitat. I personally would have absolutely no issue whatsoever with the reintroduction of wolves, but I do think that it would be so polemic and could take up a huge amount of people's energy that some of that energy might be better directed at tackling problems in another way. I know that you're going to perhaps visit in the next few days some sites in the Cairngorms, including maybe Glenfeshie, which is one of the estates where rewilding has been implemented in the last 10 years and just over 10 years. And if you'd been there 20 years ago, you would see a few vestigial old pine trees with almost nothing growing underneath them. All the heather and blaeberry plants nibbled down to just a few centimetres throughout the whole glen. As someone who did go there at that time, and now when I go back there, it's almost unrecognisable. There's vast amounts of pine and other tree regeneration throughout, you know, in large parts of the glen. And that's simply down to a very concerted effort being made over a number of years to dramatically bring down the red deer population. So I think, you know, we can achieve a huge amount in other ways.
It's beautiful.
Well,
it's beautiful.
It's a lovely place, yeah.
It's a good point to make, you know.
And I want to just say something slightly different about lynx, because we've been talking largely what we've been talking about is red deer. As Duncan said briefly earlier, there's several other deer species, one of which is native, the roe deer, and which is, because of the increasing woodland that there has been in Scotland, has now spread everywhere. And because there's less of an interest in organised hunting for that species.
Lots of cut in there about woodland, an increase in Scotland's woodland. Let's not give the wrong impression that there's...
Well, forestry.
Forestry, most of which means bad commercial forestry.
Yes.
Just wanted to make that clear.
Yes. And that's allowed roe deer to spread, and their numbers have increased dramatically. Less of an interest in commercial hunting for them. And to the extent that where you're trying to get particularly broad-leaved regeneration without fences can be problematic because of roe deer. And I know of sites where several staff members are dedicated full-time to trying to bring roe deer under control, and roe deer are of course the preferred prey of the lynx. And so I think that out of the sort of three large carnivores, bear, wolf and lynx, I think the most need and viable could be a lynx reintroduction. And there's been work done by David Hetherington, the ecologist of the Cairngorms National Park. He's something of a lynx specialist, and his PhD was on lynx, and he calculated that Scotland could support north of the Central Belt somewhere around about 300 to 400 lynx based on the existing habitat that there is.
Wow.
You know, which would be, you know, comparable to many other, you know, Europe, and would be a viable population with enough genetic diversity.
Mm-hmm.
And not to mention the nature-based tourism that it would potentially attract.
Yeah, I mean, they're pretty elusive, quite hard to see, but you might, I mean, people come to try and see Nessie, so why not? You know, yeah, there's lots of potential there.
All right. What other wildlife would you like to see returned, and why? You know, perhaps they have a beneficial impact on the countryside.
I'd like, I mean, beaver have been reintroduced, but I'd like to see a large population securely establish itself throughout Scotland. At the moment, they're under the cosh or under the 2-2 bullet or whatever it may be, which is,
Why?
taking out a lot of the population. Well, agricultural interests who have chosen to farm on the floodplain because the floodplain is so productive in terms of how, you know, the yields you can get from the floodplain. They've chosen to farm in the floodplain knowing that the floodplain floods. Well, what do you know? Beavers come and build a wee dam here and there, and the floodplain floods, and they're extremely angry about that. I would say, you know, you've got this land that's extremely productive land, you get huge yields from it, you're all driving around in Range Rovers. It doesn't appear to me that, you know, you need to be compensated when this land occasionally floods as the result of a native animal going about its business. And beavers are hugely beneficial to fish in a river because they will fell trees into the water. Those trees will decay in the water, attract a whole lot of aquatic invertebrates. While the structure is there, it provides a place for the fish to hide from predators. Also, there's a shaded spot. It might surprise you, but Scotland is actually at the upper parameter for the temperature range in which salmon eggs will survive. So any shade in the river is good. You know, you need trees for that. Beaver have evolved alongside willow trees, which grow no matter what you do to them, just about. So it's not the case of a beaver coming along and killing trees. They come along, fell trees, which regrow. You know, those trees coppice. So you get regrowth and dappled shade. It's great. That's all the ingredients you need for a healthy river, really. Beaver can provide a lot for that. Sort of lost my thread.
I think in terms of something that I would like to see, both because I think it would be interesting, but also because I think it would tell me that we were in the right, starting to get into the right place in terms of bringing a better balance between large herbivores and the environment, is shrub woodland on the in montane shrub woodland. If we went for a walk in Norway, we would walk through high forest, and as we went up and up the hill, we would eventually come out as we reached the sort of altitudinal limit where tree growth is challenged, and we would start walking through areas of more stunted trees and different species, willows, and there's a dwarf birch, for example. And that habitat, which is very widespread in Norway, and exists is effectively entirely absent from Scotland. And so I think
no other reason than grazing pressure.
Yes, and it has there's a number of other species that are associated with it, which may or may not return. But I think as a barometer of where we were at in terms of bringing what people call hyperherbivory under control, that would be a whole habitat which is currently absent, which would be great to see in Scotland. I think just a quick point while we were talking about Norway, there's an ecologist called Duncan who works at the Norwegian Institute for Nature Resources, who has put together a fascinating collection of photographs which show the southwest Norway, which has a very similar climate and geology to the Highlands of Scotland, show that landscape in the 19th century, when it basically looks like large areas of the Highlands do now, and then show the same landscape as it is today with tree growth, everywhere in the valleys and spreading up the hills. And basically the thing that changed was the numbers of herbivores were reduced.
By human intervention?
Well, I think in the Norwegian case it was that a lot of the livestock farmers were allowed to emigrate to America.
Okay.
And because of rural poverty at that time in Norway, I think a lot of people gave up and left.
Or were shooting deer to feed themselves.
Yeah, and subsequent to which, in fact, they didn't actually have all that many deer, I don't think, but subsequent to which they have a totally different hunting management regime there, which keeps numbers quite a bit lower than it does here.
And as a result, you actually have healthier deer. So when people talk about deer hunting, there are some that, oh no, we can't shoot this beautiful iconic creature. But the current deer management means that Scotland's got some of the lowest quality, most impoverished deer there are. Because the densities of deer are so high, that means they're all competing for the same food resource. The average size of deer is far smaller than it is in Norway, for example, with, as we've said, similar climate, similar geology, similar flora. So we've got absolutely the same potential to have big healthy deer, but instead we've got lots of very small, not very healthy deer.
And how would you like to see Scotland in 50 years from now? Or how do you think you'll see Scotland in 50 years from now?
Glenfishie's quite a nice example of, when did he buy that? In the 80s?
No, 2006.
Oh, right. So in quite a short time you can make a huge improvement on your land. So
and that was mainly by the deer management in Glenfishie.
Yes, they've just gone at it hard. They've shot a lot of deer, reduced their numbers right down. They still have deer there, but just not in the densities that destroy the land.
Would it be a naive question to the reintroduction of a large carnivore could be doing that work for us, or
it could be doing some of it? I think it would still have to be combined with quite a heavy deer culling regime, but yes, it could help. I mean, the Yellowstone example of them changing the habits of deer so that they spent a lot more time in the forests might give trees a chance to get away on some of the more open areas, as long as there's a seed source nearby. But what Tom was saying before about the land has been degraded to such an extent that just allowing things to get going again naturally, even in the presence of large carnivores, in some areas just isn't a possibility. It needs a little bit of a helping hand to get going.
The ball's out the bowl, isn't it? In your analogy. And where do you see Scotland in 50 years?
See it, or where would you like to see
Yeah.
it?
Well, I suppose I'm optimistic in two senses, both in the sense that I hope that there'll be an increasing realisation amongst the people who have the privilege of controlling and managing land just now about the importance of what they do for particularly our climate and how they can make a really big contribution.
Also that they have in their hands the future of Scotland, and they need to acknowledge that, recognise that. They're managing their land at the moment for their own pretty small objectives, but perhaps they could be encouraged to see a bigger picture where they can manage that land for the benefit of so many more people and animals.
And if I'm wrong about that, in spite of the some extent the cynicism that I referred to earlier about having worked close to the political process for many years, if I am wrong about that, I would like to think that the government in Scotland will be sufficiently bold and radical to take action to ensure that happens.
You mentioned it's, this plan to reduce emissions is quite ambitious already. What are some of the plans that they've got to try to meet those ambitious plans?
In other areas?
Yeah, or what's the government? What do the government plan to do to meet these ambitious?
Yeah.
objectives?
So there. I mean, within the land use sector, there are targets to plant trees.
20% by 2020 is one of the things. They want to cover 20% of Scotland's land in native trees by 2020.
And there's also money available to restore peatland, because peat bogs are a huge store of carbon. More carbon is stored in our peat bogs than in woodlands in Britain. And if peat bogs are damaged by grazing, burning, trampling by livestock and wild herbivores, that carbon can be released. So there's some money going into restoring that. But I think if you, in my opinion, if you accept, and our Environment Minister has said in Parliament that she accepts that there is a climate emergency, I think if something is an emergency, it's not something you tackle in tiny steps, over a matter of years. It's something that you address immediately, urgently, as a priority. And so I don't think government is, certainly in the sector that I know most about, which is land use and land management, that government is really addressing the scope or the need for that area to change in response to an emergency.
They are trying, but it's slow, frustratingly slow at the moment.
And how does one restore a peat bog? What's the process there?
It depends what has caused the damage. Some in the 1970s, grants were available to put drains into peat bogs to, in the logic of the time, improve them for agriculture. And so in that case, it's simply a case of stopping up those drains. Where the bogs have been damaged by trampling by deer and sheep, and splits in the peat have caused hags to form, it's a case of
excluding the sheep and deer to start with,
and then reshaping those hags so that vegetation can recolonise and heal the surface of the bog. And basically what you're looking to do is to restore the water table to what would naturally be a high level, which has a benefit both in terms of locking up the carbon that's held in the peat, but also in slowing the rate at which water reaches the main river channel, where it can cause flooding. And one of the things that we're seeing now with climate change is that we get a lot more intense rainfall.
So increased risk of flooding.
Yes.
Restoring peat bogs and having beaver around will do a lot to hold more water for longer. So you want infiltration rates as well. So where you've got lots of deer have got small hooves for a relatively large animal. They're actually very effective at squashing all the ground down and making it not great for absorbing the rain that falls on it. Rain will rush off it quite quickly. If you reduce your numbers, there's a great example. The Wild Trout Trust got a video where there's a field, it's actually a sheep field, but same thing. And on one side of the fence, they stick this tube into the ground on the sheep side, and on the other side they stick another tube into the ground, just an open tube, and they start pouring water in. And where the sheep are, the tube fills up straight away. And on the other side of the fence, so it's the same kind of ground, except on this side there's no compaction by hooves. They're just pouring and pouring and pouring and pouring. The water's just being absorbed in. It's quite dramatic, the difference. So if you're wanting to hold your rainwater on your land for longer, for the benefit of peat bogs or for flooding or for all the other climate change objectives, they can help.
moving subject slightly, Duncan, you run a nature-based tourism.
Yeah.
You run your fishing business.
Yeah.
Could you tell us more about perhaps the positive effects that has?
Yeah, so I take people on guided fishing trips, mostly tourists all over Scotland, and what I'm in these terms, what I hope I can achieve by doing that is foster an understanding and a love of the natural world that people will then be prepared to protect. You know, there's an old saying about people won't stand up for what they don't understand or what they don't know about. Once you start garnering an interest in the wilds and also knowing what's there at present, so if it's not there in 5 years down the line, you're waving a flag about it, you know. I think that's hugely beneficial today as people are spending too much time on their phones and screens and whatever. It's good to get out there into the wilds and allow the wilds to replenish you, and also be prepared to fight for them, you know. Be prepared to sign things to change government, you know.
Yeah.
Change opinion. So hopefully my business takes small steps in that direction.
And do you think people here in Scotland are getting more active? They're getting outside more?
Most of the people I take out are foreign or from down south. And actually it's interesting to see what goes on in all their countries. And in the US, you know, much of our objectives in land management are already commonplace, you know. And they're yeah.
There's a Rewilding Scotland Facebook group which has about 5,000 members, but there's a Scottish hill walking and wild camping group which has, last time I looked, it's 50,000 members and rising. So one of the things I've been saying to other friends who work in nature conservation is, you know, why don't you do some of your posting into that group? Because, you know, because I think there's a huge, certainly potential interested audience among people who do get involved in nature-based tourism. And I think, going back, you were talking about the economic importance of that. The government has studied that, and I don't have the figures right and on the tip of my tongue, but certainly if you compare the value of field sports to the value of other nature-based tourism, other nature-based tourism is an order of magnitude greater of input into the rural economy. And something I just personally have noticed, when I was still an office worker, I used to get out a lot more at weekends and do a lot of hill walking. And in fact, I've done that over the last nearly now 30 years in Scotland. And I've seen a huge change in the amount of interest in that pursuit. When I first started the hills, there were often not paths, whereas every known hill in Scotland now has a very well trodden path to the top. Whereas you could spend a whole day and perhaps see one other person or nobody often, now you would always see a number of other parties out. So I think it's a mixed picture, but I think and mountain biking as well is something which is hugely increased in popularity. So I think there's a real interest in the outdoors and a real desire of certainly a large group of the population to get outdoors, but the extent to which they're informed and engaged about the backstory to the landscape that they're enjoying, I don't know.
The common wheel, on the topic of revenue and employment from the land, the Common Wheel, which is a group in Scotland, did a report on how a grouse moor compares to different land management types when it comes to how much revenue it brings in and how much employment. And the grouse moors were down at the bottom of the list, with forestry and agriculture and horticulture and all sorts of other things, you know, ranking significantly above them.
Okay, we're sort of running out of time now, so our listeners, if you have any questions on any of the things we've just discussed, please do get in contact. I'd love to chat even longer, but yeah, we're on a time limit. So I'd like to thank you both Duncan and Tom for taking time out
Thank you,
to
Matt.
talking to us today.
Yeah, thanks
really
very much.
insightful. So thank you.
Cheers.
Okay.
Cheers.
We want to thank you for listening to our podcast, and we hope you have found the information insightful. We are very excited to be starting our activities in Scotland by partnering with the Allerdale Wilderness Reserve, which is skillfully managed by Ines McNeil. Our members will plant their first batch of trees here by the end of October, and we hope to follow this shortly with a Rewilding impact project for you guys to vote on. So again, a big thank you to everyone who enables our work, and we look forward to helping make Scotland a wilder place. Cheers!